The strip of wool was already smoking when Miriam Crane saw it. Black spruce gum bubbled through the fibers like tar in a forge. The mountain man held it with a pair of iron tongs in one hand and a narrow horn-handled knife in the other. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Her blood had dried in the hair on his wrists. Miriam backed herself against the cabin wall so hard the logs bit through her shirt. She was 6 feet 1 inch tall, and all her life, men had stepped away from her first. This man did not step away. He looked at the hole in her thigh, then at the steaming wad in his tongs. "No," she rasped. "You are not putting that inside me." Caleb Stroud's pale gray eyes lifted to hers. They did not soften. "If I don't," he said, "the outside closes pretty, the inside turns black. Then we cut the leg or we bury you." The stove snapped behind him. Snow hissed against the one small window. The whole cabin smelled of smoke, iron, wet wool, and the sour animal stink of fear. Miriam had come west to be married. Instead, before she had even heard a vow, her husband, to-be, was kneeling between her boots with a burning piece of resin, soaked cloth, and telling her the mountain was not going to ask permission. 3 hours earlier, she had still been trying not to sink into the road. The stagecoach dumped her at Mercer's Relay just after noon, in a valley of brown mud and bare cottonwoods. The driver did not climb down to help. He shoved her trunk off the back, spat into a wheel rut, and said, "This is as far as paid takes you." Miriam stood beside the trunk with her hands locked around the handle of her carpet bag. She was 23, broad, shouldered, plain, faced, and built like a door someone had forgotten to hang. In Philadelphia, women had whispered that she took up the air in a room. Her own aunt had said the Lord gave Miriam the frame of a farmhand, and the prospects of a fence post. So Miriam had answered an advertisement. Wife wanted for remote Idaho claim, winter capable, no delicate constitution, ticket paid after arrival. It had sounded insulting. It had also sounded honest. The man who rode out of the timber did not look like a groom. He came on a dun mule with a rifle across his saddle, and a second mule roped behind him. His coat was patched canvas, darkened by weather and grease. His beard hid half his face. He wore no collar, no polish, no sign that civilization had ever successfully laid a hand on him. He stopped 10 feet from her and looked up. That was the first surprise. He had to look up. "Mrs. Crane?" "Miss Crane," Miriam corrected. "Not for long. If the ridge lets us through." His voice sounded as if it had been dragged over stone. He swung down from the mule, glanced at her trunk, and lifted it onto the pack animal with one brutal heave. Miriam stared despite herself. She had dragged that trunk across 2 train platforms and 1 boarding house hallway. He made it look like a sack of oats. "You are Caleb Stroud," she said. "Usually, that is not an answer. It's the one I use." He tightened the rope, then looked at her again, not at her waist, not at the place men usually looked before deciding her face was too far away to be worth the climb. He studied her boots, her hands, her shoulders, and the height of her eye line. "I did not mention you were tall." Miriam felt the old heat climb her neck. "Your letter did not mention you smelled like a wet horse that lost a fight with a chimney." For the first time, something moved under his beard. Not a smile, exactly, a crack in the rock. Fair complaint. He pointed to the mule. "Up, weather's pinching down. I assume there is a road. There is a scar in the mountain that lets animals lie to themselves." Comforting. Wasn't meant to be. She climbed onto the mule without asking for his hand. Caleb noticed he gave no compliment. He simply took the lead rope and began walking. The trail narrowed within the first mile. At first there were wagon ruts, then hoof marks, then only a wet line of trampled needles cutting along the flank of the mountain. A cold mist fell through the pines. Not rain, not snow. Something meaner, small enough to crawl into collars and sleeves. Miriam sat rigid on the mule, trying to keep her balance, while the animal picked its way over slick stone. The drop to her right opened wider with every switchback. The valley below disappeared into fog. The trees leaned over the path as if listening. Caleb did not speak unless the trail demanded it. "Lean left. Keep your knee off that trunk. Do not grab the brush. Half of it has thorns." Miriam disliked him almost immediately. She disliked his certainty, his silence, his assumption that fear was a waste of breath. She disliked the way he walked in front of danger, as if he had already made peace with being devoured by it. Then the mule stopped. Ahead, the trail was blocked by a tangle of winterfall. A fir had come down from the slope above, dragging a snarl of roots, limbs, and frozen dirt across the path. The trunk had wedged itself between two boulders. On the mountain side there was rock. On the valley side there was nothing but air and fog. Caleb stood still for a long moment. Miriam waited for him to curse. He did not. Get down. Why? Because if we turn the animals here, one goes over. Miriam looked at the drop and climbed down at once. Caleb unlashed a short pry pole from the pack mule. It was a thick length of cedar with one end shaved flat and dark from use. He jammed it under the fir's root mass, tested the pressure, then looked at Miriam. "Can you pull?" She almost laughed. "Mr. Stroud, pulling is one of the few accomplishments my body has ever been allowed." He did not smile this time. He pointed to the exposed limb twisted across the trail. "Use your weight, not your arms. When I say, sit back hard." The old humiliation in her chest shifted. He had not said it like an insult. He had said it like weight was useful. They worked together. Caleb drove the pry pole under the roots. Miriam wrapped both hands around the wet limb and leaned back until her boots scraped mud from the stone. The fir groaned. Earth crumbled. The mule snorted and danced away from the edge. "Again," Caleb grunted. Miriam set her jaw and pulled harder. The tree moved for one clean second. The mountain yielded to them. Then the cedar pole snapped. The broken end whipped out from under the roots with a sound like a pistol shot. Miriam saw only a blur of pale wood. Something struck her leg high on the outer thigh. The force spun her sideways and knocked her onto the trail. She landed hard enough to bite her tongue for a moment. There was no pain, only pressure. Then she looked down. A spear of splintered cedar, thick as 2 fingers, had punched through her skirt and buried itself deep in her leg. The wood trembled with her heartbeat. Miriam opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Caleb was already there. "Don't move. That is in me. I can see." His calm enraged her more than panic would have. He cut her skirt from hem to hip with one stroke of his knife. Cold air hit bare skin. Blood had not yet begun to run, but the flesh around the wood was white and stretched. Miriam grabbed his sleeve. "Do not touch it. I have to." "No. You want to ride 3 hours with that sticking out." She looked at the fog, the trail, the mule, the blood beginning to bead black around the cedar. Caleb put one hand above the wound, one hand around the splinter. He did not count. He pulled. Pain did not enter her. It detonated. Miriam screamed so hard the sound seemed to tear bark off the trees. Blood rushed down her thigh, hot and thick, turning the mud beneath her boot red. Caleb shoved a folded cloth against the wound and pressed until her vision sparked. "You butcher," she gasped. "Later," he said. "Be angry later." He bound the cloth in place with a strip torn from his own shirt, then half carried her to the mule. He did not ask whether she could climb. He put his shoulder under her arm and lifted her as if she were a beam being set into a wall. The next hours came apart into pieces. The mule's spine under her, the cold rain on her eyelids, Caleb's back moving ahead of her, never hurried, never stopping, the bandage going warm, then wet, then stiff. Her hands locked around the saddle horn. The smell of her own blood under the sharper smell of crushed cedar. The cabin appeared at dusk as if the mountain had grown a scab. It sat under a stone overhang above a black creek, built from unpeeled logs and roofed with sod. No porch, no curtain, no welcome. Smoke crawled from the stovepipe and vanished into sleet. Caleb opened the door with his shoulder and brought her inside. The room was one hard square of survival. Stove in the middle, rope bed against the far wall, a table hacked from planks, traps hanging from pegs, dried herbs and animal hides swinging in the rafters. Everything had a purpose, and none of those purposes was comfort. He set Miriam on the bed. The mattress, crunched with straw, "Stay awake. I am in no danger of enjoying myself. Good." He lit a lamp, gold light shook across the walls. Then he built the stove so fast it felt like violence, kindling, resin chips, match, flame. He put a kettle on the iron plate and washed his hands in whiskey until the whole cabin reeked of it. Miriam tried to sit up, her leg refused. Caleb cut away the ruined fabric, unwrapped the sodden cloth, and leaned close. His face changed. Not much. Enough. Deep puncture. Dirt in it. Cedar splinters, too. Then remove them. I aim to. She regretted the sentence immediately. He poured whiskey into the wound. Miriam's breath vanished. Her hands clawed the rope edge of the bed. Before she could recover, he pushed 2 fingers into the torn track and felt for splinters. The humiliation was nearly worse than the pain. No man in Philadelphia had ever held her hand for longer than politeness required. Now this stranger had his blood-slick fingers inside her leg while she sobbed into a blanket and hated him for seeing what fear made of her. He drew out 1 splinter, then another, then a third, thin as a quill and dark with blood. Last one, he muttered. You said that before. This time, I mean it. Your promises are poor. Never said otherwise. When he finally sat back, Miriam was shaking so hard her teeth clicked. Caleb crossed to a shelf and returned with a tin cup, a jar of black spruce gum, a strip of clean wool, and a knife with a horn handle polished from use. He warmed the spruce gum near the stove until it softened and shone. Then he pressed it into the wool. The smell filled the cabin, sharp resin, smoke, animal fat, and something bitter he had crushed into it. Miriam watched the strip begin to smoke. That was when fear became larger than pain. He lifted the wool with tongs. She dragged herself backward until the log stopped her. No, she rasped. You are not putting that inside me. Caleb looked at her for a long second. If I close it clean, it will kill you dirty. The rot needs somewhere to drain. The gum keeps the wound open and keeps the filth from settling deeper. It will burn. Yes, that is all you have to say. No. It'll burn badly. She stared at him. He was filthy, blunt, unschooled in every softness she had once been told a husband should possess. His hair hung in damp, black strands around his face. His coat was stiff with freezing rain. Her blood marked him from wrist to elbow, but he was not lying to her. That was the terrible mercy of him. Back east, a doctor might have smiled and spoken gently and hidden the truth behind Latin. Caleb Stroud offered no comfort that could not survive inspection. Miriam swallowed bile. Hold me down. He blinked once. If you ask me to stop, I may not. I know. Then bite this. Miriam gripped the mattress with both hands. Caleb drove the smoking wool into the wound. The burn was a white animal. It tore through her, hotter than language, hotter than shame. Her back arched off the bed. The strap muffled a sound she had never imagined could come from her own body. Caleb pinned her there while his other hand worked with the knife, packing the wool deep enough to hold. Stay in the room, Miriam, he said. Not Miss Crane, Miriam. Stay in the room. Curse me if you need to. She did. Through the leather, through the tears, through the ripping heat, she cursed him, the cabin, the mule, the advertisement, and every woman in Philadelphia who had ever called her too much. Caleb did not flinch from any of it. At last the first blaze settled into a vicious throb. Her body sagged. The leather fell from her mouth. Caleb tied a clean bandage around her thigh and pulled a blanket over her without looking at the torn places where her skirt had failed to cover her. Then he poured whiskey in a cup. This time he offered it to her. Drink, she drank. It burned less than everything else. Caleb sat on the stool beside the bed for the first time. He looked tired. Miriam's voice came out broken. Do all your brides get this welcome? Only the promising ones. A laugh escaped her before she could stop it. It was ugly, wet, and half pain. Caleb's mouth twitched. I needed someone who would not snap in the first hard weather, he said. The agent wrote that you were large, stubborn, and unlikely to be missed kindly. Miriam turned her face toward him. And that appealed to you. It sounded like the truth. Most men would have run from that truth. Most men out here are dead by spring. The stove popped. Snow tapped the window like fingernails. Miriam looked down at the bandage. Her leg pulsed around the packed wool as if the mountain had put a coal under her skin. You bought a burden. Caleb leaned forward, elbows on knees. No, he said. I bought a chance at a partner. The word hung in the cabin, rough and strange. Partner, no one had ever used it for her, without meaning labor they wanted to dump at her feet. Miriam closed her eyes. "If I keep the leg," she whispered, "you owe me a coat. Mine is ruined." "Then keep the leg." His answer should have annoyed her. Instead, as the whiskey dragged her down, she felt his calloused hand move a strand of damp hair from her face. The touch was brief, almost awkward. It vanished before she could decide what it meant. The fever came the next night. It did not rise slowly. It struck like a door being kicked open. 1 hour Miriam was cold under 3 blankets. The next she was burning through all of them, her skin hot enough that Caleb pulled the bedding away and wiped her with creek water until she cursed him hoarse. The cabin lost its edges. The rafters became the ceiling of the Philadelphia boarding house. The hanging furs became women in narrow dresses whispering behind gloves, too tall, too broad. A man would need a ladder to kiss her. A man would need a barn to keep her. Miriam tried to lift her hands to cover her ears, but someone caught her wrists. "Not there," Caleb's voice said. "You're on the ridge." "I take up too much room," she mumbled. "You take up the room you need. That is not how rooms work. It is here." He forced broth between her lips. He held her shoulders when the chills shook her so hard, the bed ropes creaked. He cleaned the wound with the same awful steadiness, never turning tender, never turning cruel. He changed the outer dressings while looking only at what infection would look like and how to fight it. The second day, she begged him to pull the wool out. He refused. The third day, she tried to climb from the bed, convinced the stagecoach was leaving without her. Caleb caught her before she hit the floor. "I paid for a wife," he grunted, lifting her back onto the mattress. "Not a ghost. You paid after arrival," she slurred. "Then don't make me a liar." She laughed in the fever, and then sobbed because laughing hurt. Through it all, Caleb remained a dark shape at the edge of her vision. Sometimes at the stove, sometimes on the stool, sometimes kneeling by the bed with a wet cloth in his hand, and the expression of a man listening to a storm decide whether to take his roof. When the fever finally broke, the silence woke her. No roaring blood, no whispering women, no fire in her bones, only the scrape of a blade on whetstone and the low breath of the stove. Miriam opened her eyes. Morning light lay thin and gray over the cabin. Caleb sat at the table sharpening a skinning knife. His beard had gone wild. His eyes were hollowed with 4 nights of almost no sleep. He looked up and saw her looking back. "The fever's gone," he said. That sounded almost pleased. "Don't strain yourself imagining it." "Water." He brought the dipper and held it to her mouth. She drank greedily. Some spilled down her chin. He wiped it away with his thumb before either of them could pretend not to notice. "How long?" she asked. 4 days. Her mind cleared around one fact. "The wedding?" Caleb glanced toward a battered Bible wrapped in oilcloth on the shelf. "Still there. I thought men were impatient for wives. Dead ones are poor company." Miriam closed her eyes, and for one fragile second, she felt something dangerously close to gratitude. Then her bladder made itself known. Humiliation returned faster than strength. She lay there, stiff with it, staring at the wall while Caleb stirred oats at the stove. "Mr. Stroud." "Caleb, do not be generous. It alarms me." "What?" She clenched the blanket in both fists. "I need the chamber pot." The spoon stopped. The silence filled the cabin and pressed on every bruise inside her pride. Caleb did not turn around. He set the spoon down, walked to a stack of split wood, and brought out a chipped enamel pot. He placed it beside the bed within reach. Then he took his hat from the peg, opened the door, and stepped into the freezing morning. He closed the door behind him. Miriam stared at it. He had not smiled. He had not sighed. He had not looked at her like a problem to be endured. He had simply given her privacy as if dignity were another tool a person needed to survive. When he returned, she was back under the blanket, sweating from the effort. The pot was pushed out of sight. Caleb knocked snow from his boots and went straight to the stove. "Creeks froze over again," he said, as if they had been discussing weather the entire time. Miriam watched his back. "I can help haul water when I stand." "I know." The answer landed harder than praise. He handed her a bowl of oats with dried chokecherries stirred through it. It was gray, lumpy, and the best thing she had ever eaten. 3 weeks later, Miriam stood on one leg at Caleb's table with both hands inside a dead fox. The wound had closed ugly but clean. The spruce gum had worked itself out in a blackened plug that left a puckered ring of pink flesh. Her leg itched deep in the muscle and ached when snow came in. Caleb had carved her a crutch from birch, but she hated the helpless knock of it on the floor, so she found work that could be done standing still. She mended shirts, scrubbed pans with salt, sorted cartridges, boiled beans, stacked kindling, and argued with the stove as if it had personal opinions. She would not become furniture in a one-room cabin. When Caleb brought in fox, marten, and hare from the trapline, she asked to skin them. He looked at her hands. "You'll tear the pelt. Then teach me not to." He should have refused. Instead, he set the fox on the table and gave her the small knife. The first cuts were clumsy. Her fingers were too long for delicate work, or so she thought, but Caleb stood beside her, quiet, correcting the angle with a word or a touch. "Peel, don't hack, use the thumb. Let the hide tell you where it wants to separate." When his hand covered hers near the ear of the fox, she went still. It was the first time he had touched her when she was not bleeding. His hand was hot, rough, missing half the end of one finger. It enclosed hers without making it seem small. "Easy there," he murmured. "I have it." He released immediately. "You do." She finished the pelt without tearing it. Caleb held it up to the lamp. The fur hung clean. "That'll sell." From him, it was a sonnet. Miriam wiped blood from her fingers and looked around the cabin. The table scarred by knives. The stove that smoked when the wind turned. The snow pressed high against the walls. The man stretching a fox pelt with the solemn care of a churchman handling scripture. She had fled east because her body made her useless in the wrong rooms. Here, her hands made money. The storm came 2 days after that. It arrived in the afternoon as a white wall that erased the creek, the mule pen, and the nearest trees. By evening the door would not open. Wind drove snow through the chinks and made the lamp flames lean sideways. The cabin became an arc of smoke and animal skins in a sea of ice. Caleb dug in his trunk and pulled out the Bible. Miriam knew at once. The transaction had been waiting under everything, under the fever, the bandages, the oats, the fox pelt. Now it rose and stood between them. Caleb placed the Bible on the table. "Leg steady enough?" Miriam's mouth went dry. "For what?" He looked at her then, and for once the bluntness cost him something, for standing beside me. She almost preferred him rude. Rudeness was easier to parry. She pushed herself up with the crutch. She wore one of his old shirts tucked into a wool skirt he had clumsily widened at the waist with scraps of canvas. Her hair hung loose because her pins had been lost on the trail. There were scars under her bandage, smoke in her braid, and blood under one fingernail from the fox. She looked nothing like a bride. Caleb looked nothing like a groom. They stood on opposite sides of the table while the storm tried to pry the roof loose. Caleb opened the Bible, but he did not read. "I, Caleb Stroud, take Miriam Crane as my wife," he said. His voice was low and rough, every word shaped as if he had carved it from bone. "I will keep fire under this roof, meat in the pot when meat can be had, and my body between yours and whatever comes through that door." Miriam's throat tightened despite herself. He swallowed. "I will not make you small to make myself larger." The wind slammed against the logs. Miriam gripped the table. No one had ever promised her that. She looked at his hands, scarred and steady on either side of the Bible. Then she looked at the man himself, unpolished, harsh, honest past the point of comfort. "I, Miriam Crane, take Caleb Stroud as my husband," she said. Her alto voice shook once, then found its footing. "I will keep your fire when you are gone, work what can be worked, mend what can be mended, and stand my ground beside you." She lifted her chin. "I will not apologize for the room I take." Caleb's eyes changed, not softened, not exactly, opened. He held out his hand. There was no ring, no witness, no music, only the Bible, the storm, and two people too large for the life that had first been offered to them. Miriam took his hand. The grip was not— it was a seal. "Done," Caleb said. "Done," Miriam answered. They released each other slowly afterward. He did not kiss her. He wrapped the Bible again, put it in the trunk, and returned to repairing a trap spring. Miriam limped to the stove and stirred the beans. It should have felt empty. Instead, it felt clean. By midnight, the temperature fell so low the water bucket filmed over with ice 6 feet from the stove. Miriam lay on the rope bed under every blanket in the cabin. Caleb had taken the floor by the door with the buffalo robe. He had given her the warmest place without comment. At first she let him. Then she heard his teeth. A hard, fast clicking in the dark. Caleb, it stopped. Go to sleep. You are freezing. No. You are lying badly. A long silence. Floor's mean tonight. The floor is killing you. Bed won't hold us both. Then the bed can learn. He did not move. Miriam turned her head toward the shadow on the floor. I did not vow to stand beside you so you could die 3 feet away out of politeness. That worked. Caleb rose, gathered the buffalo robe, and came to the bed. The frame groaned when he lay down. The mattress sagged toward him at once, pulling Miriam's shoulder against his arm. They were absurdly large in the narrow bed. Too much bone, too much wool, too much silence. His shirt was cold as river stone. Beneath it, his body was hot as the stove. Neither of them moved for a long time. Leg? He asked. Do not touch it. Wasn't going to. You say that as if I am unreasonable. You are alive. I allow for the rest. The laugh that moved through her was quiet enough to be mistaken for breath. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, warmth gathered between them by slow degrees. It was not romance as the boarding-house girls had described it. No roses, no poetry, no trembling declarations. It was two heavy bodies refusing to let winter take either one alone. At some point, Caleb shifted onto his side. He did not put an arm around her. He only moved close enough that his chest warmed her back, careful to leave space near the wounded leg. Miriam let him. For the first time since arriving in Idaho, she slept without bracing. Spring came violently. The snow sank in 1 week. Water tore down every rut, turning the slope below the cabin into a brown sliding mess. The creek, silent all winter under ice, woke furious. Pines shed snow in thunderous collapses. The air smelled of thawed earth, wet bark, and rot. Miriam learned to walk with the limp. At first she hated it. The right leg dragged when she was tired, the scar pulled. Cold weather made the muscle seize. She would never move like she had before. Then Caleb set an axe beside the chopping block and said, "Split only what the leg allows." She split twice that. He watched from the mule pen. "You're favoring the left. I am favoring the leg that did not attempt to leave me." Fair. By May she could haul water. By June she could set snares near the creek. By July she could carry one end of a log while Caleb carried the other, and they could lay a new roof pole without speaking, because their weight answered each other. The cabin changed. Not prettily. Usefully, a shelf appeared over the table, because Miriam refused to keep flour where mice could discuss it. The door got a second bar. The chimney stopped smoking after she made Caleb admit the draft was badly cut. The trap boards were sorted. The beans were labeled in charcoal. A second stool was built, wider and sturdier than the first. Caleb never said she had improved the place. He simply stopped putting things where she had decided they were wrong. One afternoon, he rode down to Mercer's relay for salt, lamp oil, and mail. He was gone 6 days. The old fear tried to return on the 4th night, that the mountain had swallowed him, that the mule had gone lame, that she had become a widow before she had learned how to be a wife. On the 6th day, she heard hooves. She was splitting kindling in the yard, sleeves rolled, hair braided down her back, the scar in her thigh burning from the damp. Caleb came up the trail leading both mules. Dust whitened his hat. His beard was fuller. His eyes went first to the axe in her hand, then to her leg, then to her face. "You stayed upright," he said. "You stayed alive. Had business. So did I." He unloaded flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, and a packet of needles wrapped in newspaper. Then he took one last bundle from the mule. It was long, heavy, tied in brown paper and cord. Miriam eyed it. "If that is a plow, I am going back to Philadelphia. You'd have to walk. Then I will haunt you from the way station." He held out the bundle. "Open it." She cut the cord with her belt knife. Inside was a coat. Not a lady's coat. not a fitted thing meant to make her look smaller. It was a long oilcloth duster lined with thick sheep wool, reinforced at the shoulders, elbows, and hem. The seams were double-stitched. The pockets were deep enough for gloves, cartridges, and a hammer. The collar could stand up against wind. The sleeves were long enough. Miriam touched the cuff as if it might vanish. Caleb looked at the mule's pack saddle instead of her face. I measured your reach against the cabin door. Sent the numbers down with a freight man in March. Told the tailor not to trim it pretty. Told him to cut it for weather, work, and a woman who swings tools. Miriam could not speak. He had not bought lace. He had not bought perfume. He had not bought something to apologize for what she was. He had bought armor in her size. She put it on. The coat settled over her shoulders with a weight that felt like recognition. It did not pinch. It did not pull. It did not ask her to fold herself into less. It gave room to breathe, bend, lift, and strike. Caleb finally looked at her. Well? Miriam buttoned the brass buttons one by one. The old rooms in Philadelphia seemed very far away, the whispers, the jokes, the way she used to angle her body to make doorways feel less crowded. All of it belonged to another woman, one who had not screamed on a mountain trail, burned through fever, skinned fox, taken vows in a blizzard, and learned that survival was not the absence of tenderness. Sometimes tenderness was a man standing in mud with a custom-made coat he was too embarrassed to call a gift. "It fits," she said. Her voice broke on the last word. Caleb's hand lifted. For a moment, she thought he might touch her face. Instead, he gripped the reinforced lapel of the coat and tugged her one step closer. Their foreheads met. No audience, no music, no pretty line to close the scene. Just Caleb smelling of mule sweat and cold iron, Miriam smelling of wood smoke and split cedar, and the two of them standing under a violent blue sky in front of a cabin that no longer looked like it was waiting to reject her. The mountain had not made her smaller. It had finally become large enough to hold her. And Caleb Stroud, who had once looked at her like a useful fact, now held her like the whole roof might depend on the strength of her standing there. In the end, the transaction did not become love because the world turned gentle. It became love because neither of them did. They stayed hard where hardness kept them alive. They became soft only in the places the other had earned. And Miriam Crane, the woman Philadelphia had called too much, stood in a coat built to her measure and understood at last that some people are not born oversized. They are born load-bearing,